So I kind of wanted to learn a little bit about how you got started. So your passion, I can see that the overarching theme is that you're a storyteller, whether it's through movies or through books or through your blog. Like you love to tell stories, and that's definitely something we have in common. So when do you think you started telling stories or being interested in stories in general?
I I know when I started, this is interesting. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas both told me this, Viviana. They said they would never have been in the movie business had they not been born into the middle class. Because when they were born into the middle class, their parents were able to help them buy a motion picture camera. And because, as you know, and in those times, things were more expensive. I mean, I think an 8mm camera cost about $200, so that was a lot of money for an 8 or 10-year-old. And for me, I had a paper route, and I wanted to save up for a camera, and I wanted to save it up because I was. My brother was a very strong personality. My older brother, he was very good in school. He was very good in athletics. And I kind of felt that I was in his shadow. And I needed to find a way to express myself. And for some reason, whether it was still photography or making little videos, that was a way by which I could shine inside the shadow of my brother. And so that's what I started to do at age 9 years old. And I started making little films in the backyard and splicing them together. You know, I would go down to the drugstore and find my money from the paper route. And then a kind of serendipitous moment happened between myself, was a small, lived in a small town in Ohio called Hudson, that I came in contact at 12 years old with Walt Disney. So, and that was a kind of a confirmation that really altered my destiny. Because I came from a very spiritual family. My mom, was a very heavy-duty Catholic. And there were 5 boys in my family, and I was to be the priest. They kind of offered me up. That's what I was going to do. So instead of getting footballs at Christmas, I was getting holy water from Lord.
Oh, wow.
So it was kind of hard to escape that, but I didn't really feel that was my fate, even though I was an altar boy, and I tried to pray and tried to be with the Lord and all those kinds of things. And I know you're laughing because you're also from Puerto Rico, so okay, we get this.
Yeah,
but that's part of our culture. It was part of our culture and who we were. And did the Lord speak to you last night? Well, I don't know. Let me finish my orange juice. 10 years old. So I was looking at television one night. There used to be a show called The Wonderful World of Disney, and Walt Disney would be on Sunday night at 7 o'clock, and he would introduce like Davy Crockett or Snow White or whatever the story was for the evening. And he did this year in and year out. So by the time I was 12, I was so familiar with Mr. Disney. And he disappeared off the television set. And I was bewildered, and he didn't come back for several weeks. And I asked my dad and mom, I said, well, where is Mr. Disney? And they just turned to one another, and they said, he's very sick. And I thought about it, and I also thought, I was a spiritual kid who wanted to do things right, and I didn't really want to join the priesthood. And I thought, oh, well, I could do something nice for Mr. Disney. And I could make a little movie and cheer him up. So my brother and I made, dressed up and put on costumes, and I directed a little movie in my backyard to cheer up Mr. Disney. And my dad, who was a steel salesman, said, well, now what are you going to do, boy? What are you going to do with that? How are you going to get it to Mr. Disney? And I said, well, I don't know. I guess I will mail it to him. And he said, no, you need a contact inside, boy. And he said, I'll tell you a secret. He's a salesman. I'll tell you a secret. Get friendly with Mr. Disney's secretary.
This is amazing.
He will know where to put it. She will know where to get that film. So he said, if you're willing, I will make, because it was long distance at the time. I was in Ohio. They were out in Burbank, California. Uh-huh. I will make a long distance call as long as you talk to the secretary. And the first thing to do is you ask for her name, because that's a sign of respect. And during the conversation, you call her by her name several times. So for me, Viviana, it was an incredible education in practicality of aspiration. It wasn't just like bringing something out there. It was like, this is what you do. You pick up the phone and you call the secretary. So he dialed the phone, and we went long distance. And I asked for Mr. Disney's office, and I got Peggy on the phone. And I was talking like this, and, it's this little 12-year-old boy. And, my father had a sense of that. And, the 12-year-old boy is asked, he said, well, I made a little movie for, Mr. Disney to cheer him up. I understand he's not well. And, I said it's 8 millimeter, and she was like, well, there is an 8 millimeter projector down in animation. I could get that to show your movie to Mr. Disney. And this man was dying. He died 3 weeks later, lung cancer. He was a smoker. He was 61 years old, 62 years old, and he was in the Burbank hospital. But I didn't know any of this, and the future had yet to be. And so I did as he asked. I sent the film in, and to care of her at Walt Disney's office. And 2 weeks later, like magic, out of like a Disney movie, I opened the mailbox, and there was a letter from Walt Disney Studios.
Wow!
And it was a handwritten note from Walt Disney saying the movie did indeed cheer him up, and thank you very much for reaching out to me, and I want you to know that I'm starting a school for young artists to perfect their craft, and I hope that when you grow up, you will come to the school and be able to perfect your talents, something to that effect. Keep on doing good stuff. Yours sincerely, Walt Disney. And,
wow.
And it's interesting because Walt had set that school up as a feeder school. It was called California Institute of the Arts, and he had imagined the school to be kind of an art school, rival the science school of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So in California, Massachusetts, so it was going to be a school for the arts. But the practical reality of Walt Disney is he looks around and he can't see young animators coming up the ranks, and so he figured if he opened up a school, he could feed the studio with new graduates in animation.
Exactly.
And so try to be now succinct. I applied to the school when I was 17. It was the first year that the school was going to open. I got accepted into the school. It was relatively small. The film school was only like 100 students. And yet, I came from a large Catholic family. My dad sat me down and said, we can't really afford it unless you're able to get a scholarship or a working scholarship or something. And so I called the admissions, Donald Biggs had admissions and said that I wasn't able to attend. I'm so sorry, but we can't seem to find the money to support 4 years of college. And son of a gun, if like in another week the phone didn't ring in my little, Hudson, Ohio, and it was Donald Biggs saying that they found a letter in the foundation file from Peggy that Mr. Disney's request, if David Kirkpatrick cannot afford college, then the foundation will find the money to support him.
Wow.
Now, you talk about the presence of mind of a dying man and his secretary who still believed in the dream, even though he physically wasn't going to be there.
Wow.
And that, to me, still haunts me. It still haunts me, and I sense Mr. Disney in my life every day. That I've never met him, and to top it off, I then I was head of production of his studio for several years.
Wow.
And so, we can still be affected by people who are no longer with us. And they can still, in a negative way, they can still control us. And sometimes they can liberate us. I mean, it's memory, of course. It's affection or some kind of emotional bond, of course. But it may also be something else that we all call the ineffable. That we don't, what if St. Francis says, the real things are invisible to the eye.
Yeah.
But I felt his love and compassion, and all I did was, send him a little movie. And that, meant the world to me. And I try every day, especially in this phase of my life, I try to find a way to give back, because that's what Mr. Disney would have done. And,
I think it's impressive that, it's also about that emotion, it's empathy, it's connection, but it's also paying attention, no? Because your dad paid attention to you, even though what you were doing might have been completely unrealistic, right? So the fact that your dad encouraged you and he listened to what you were trying to do and wasn't just like, yeah, boy, well, good luck with that. He's not going to see it. And then Peggy listening to a little kid on the phone and not being like, oh, here's another person calling. And Mr. Disney, also like it's big on paying attention to the little things, because that's the way that you can truly have an impact, right? Like you could have been just another kid that people ignored, but clearly everybody had an eye for you. That's amazing.
Yeah, I think there is something in us. I'm sure that's in you, in any number of ways. There is something in us that just tells us, and I'm not talking about good or bad or evil or exception, it just says from time to time, this is the thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think, that's mindfulness, that's listening, that's being attentive, but it's also being attentive to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the Holy Spirit? Is that the stuff that moves the cosmos? And we don't yet know that about ourselves, because at some point in this cognitive revolution that happened somewhere between 70,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago, our brains became minds that took into a greater scope, because the thing that sapiens could do was they could imagine things that did not exist. They could, in their mind, think about boats that could go to sea, could think of temples that could be raised to the sky. They thought about myths that they could put on stage. They somehow something now to of stories that we all know from religious books, etc. Was that some kind of divine spark? Was that just a mutation of such a magnitude that it still shocks us? But the mind is something that goes beyond our reality and sees things that could be but aren't yet. And I think the world would be a lot better off if we were able to all be more attentive, all listen a little better, and not necessarily categorize or demonize, but instead try to understand.
Definitely. And I think a part of why I wanted to do Life Whispers is because, I have always said everybody has a story, and sometimes we kind of disregard certain people because we don't think they have a story. But sometimes, even if they're a gardener or our Uber drivers or, the cashier at the register, like, if we really pay attention, these people can teach us so much,
No, totally. I totally agree.
And going off of the, the mindfulness and all the powerful things that we can do with our minds, I feel like as a kid, you were very passionate about, your camera and your videos. So because you mentioned that you had this experience with Walt Disney at 12, but you applied at 17. So you were always very focused on what you wanted your path to be. So what happened after the school? Do you think that focus, that vision, it was always very prevalent, and you kept kind of aspiring for bigger and stronger goals?
Well, I love my experience at college. But
you what? Sorry?
I loved my experience at college. Okay? No?
Yeah.
Okay. But they did not equip us for life.
Yeah.
And our dean of film said, well, you'll never end up, and none of you will end up getting jobs in the business, but you have an appreciation for film. So that was kind of the attitude of the school, and there was no placement programs, etc. And so you're a little intimidated about what to do because you're not really guided as to what to do. I mean, all you see are these big monoliths like Paramount and Disney and Universal, and and how do you break behind the walls? How do you get in? But for me, I always thought I could tell good writing, and I started, like a lot of us, I worked as a waiter. I worked in a call center, not very long, but for a few months, which of course maybe seems like forever. What I found out, what was available is I could possibly get a job in the studio reading scripts. And if I could read scripts then and identify good writing, then that's what movies were all about. And so I created a little file system. In those days, there were, of course, no emails or anything else. And, so I created a file system for all the story editors in the business. And there weren't that many, maybe 25 or so. The studios, there were maybe 8 or 10 studios, and then the independent production companies that were large enough to have story editors. So I kept them all in a file box, like, recipes. And I called and wrote letters and just kept doing that until I could write some sample reader coverages. In film, studio might get hundreds of scripts a week, but the executives couldn't read them all. Mm-hmm. So they were at first read by a reader who would then synopsize them. But the money was good, and if I could get into the union, there were 52 other story analysts in the union. I'd pretty much be set for life, even if not that was going to be the final stepping stone for me. But I knew that, the union was strong, and, I'd have to pass a certain level of certification, et cetera. So for me, the only thing I can say is that I just persisted for about 6 months until I got hired by Columbia Pictures, because there was nobody on the roster in the Story Analyst Guild, and so they could at that time bring in new people. So that's how I started in the business, was reading scripts. And generally in reading scripts, if you read 10 a week and synopsized them, that was pretty much your work for the week. So that's how I got started. And my first job at Columbia was to do a legal analysis from a content standpoint, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was Steven Spielberg's movie at Columbia. But he had written a letter to a man who wrote a book called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And said, I love that title of that book so much, and that he used it as the title of my movie. So that created a bit of a stir. So Columbia was worried that the film was originally called Watch the Skies, and even changed the name of it, and we needed to figure out if there was too much similarities, and that Columbia would have to figure out a way to buy the book or settle up with the original writer of the book. So I was charged with doing an analysis on that. So that's how I started, and my focus was always story, writers. I had a literary bent, so I knew who Nathaniel Hawthorne was. I knew The Great Gatsby. I'm not talking about a deep education in literature, but at least I could present myself in a room and give some kind of value add, because it was all about stories. And, people were busy casting or creating budgets, and so that was, so I became the kind of story guy. And then when I went to Paramount Pictures, there were several projects, including the book Ordinary People, including the play Elephant Man, that I had discovered for the studio, and both of those were projects that we made at Paramount, and both got a lot of acknowledgement as being good stories, and directed by good people, and won all kinds of awards. And so I found myself rising in influence with pictures that I had worked on that became successful. So in my case, and things can happen in a number of different cases, I sort of rose into influence and became a production executive and then vice president and eventually president of the studio because the pictures that I worked on from a script standpoint and then later in production were successful. So that's essentially how I started, but it was all really going back to an early interest in telling stories visually. Yes, and it was, and you raised a good point, Viviana. It wasn't that it just came to me. As the Dalai Lama will say, remember your practice. Mm-hmm. And, you kind of have to practice it every day. And I wasn't so good when I first started out, but because I calculate that over my career in movies, I read over 80,000 screenplays. That's a lot.
Wow.
And
that's a lot.
Probably more than any other living person.
Wow.
I was a real workaholic. And most of the time was spent reading, finding writing samples, hiring writers, etc. So like Malcolm Gladwell, who says it's 10,000 hours. Well, I sure put in my 10,000 hours in terms of reading. Wow. And that was a benefit. That was surely a benefit.
And it didn't feel like 10,000 hours?
Oh, no, because you're falling in the good stories, you're falling into the story and you're traveling with the story. Yes.
Exactly. And do you think, so this is from the, there's the passion, there's obviously the practice like you're mentioning. What do you think you had in you as a person, like a skill, whether it's persistence or patience, determination? Like, what do you think is one of those qualities that you have in you that had allowed you to become this passionate person that was able to put their passions into practice? Like one skill that kind of stands out.
I wasn't afraid to cry. I read material that moved me, and when that happened, I knew that something was working in terms of the writer, and so it was. People used to laugh at me because they said, I'd cry while grinding coffee. But it didn't get really that bad. But I'm a big crybaby, and most of the better work that I ever discovered were people who could really, in a script, make you cry, and so whether it be terms of endearment or whether it be Ordinary People, those were scripts that then became movies that made people cry. Or even Elephant Man. It's like, I am not an animal. I wept during that scene. But, so I often cried a river. But I think that was also because I felt that not only was I being moved by the story, but I was being moved by the talent that had created that story.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do believe that the best communicators are communicators that love their audience and love their message. And in that, when you can find that thing, that particular writer who loves his audience and loves his message, those two things, wow, then you really found something special. And
yeah, no, it's definitely a talent to have the ability to tap into people's emotions to the point where they, they cry or they laugh or they get scared. Like it's not that easy to convey that type of story that makes people feel, because you're making people feel.
Right.
not an easy thing to do. That's amazing. I really love, and we can talk about like the industry in general. It's very glamorous and very glamorized. So listening to, I think what kind of captivated me about you when you spoke at Royal Caribbean is that it felt so authentic, right? You can watch TV and Hollywood seems so fabulous, and you can let me know what your experience is. But when I talk to you, I don't hear Hollywood. I hear passion, stories, emotions, and that just makes me feel like you're a very genuine person, and the experiences you've had come from the heart more than the glamorous that accompanies a life in Hollywood. So I think that's great. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that, about the industry in general and your experience?
Sure. I think the industry gets a bad rap. There's scandal. That always gets the headlines. We're going through all that now with Me Too, and of course, all that stuff is shocking and horrible and needed to be cleansed. But by and large, there's hardworking people doing their job, working late, making sacrifices in order to be able to help with the movie project. And the work ethic and the creative ethic to do something good. Now there's the Kleinmeisters and the edgy people who are just trying to make a buck, but they're not the pervasive ones in terms of the industry. Secondly, it's a relatively small industry. Not that there's any closed wall anybody can break in. I think it's harder for actors and actresses because, to a degree, there's a certain level of being at the right place at the right time for the right part, and that's hard to kind of design a plan around. Though people like Julia Roberts did, she was very, she just knocked on doors and saw people and brought her resume in and had general meetings, and she was very luminant and radiant, and I know that was part of why we cast her in Pretty Woman, but it was a small business. There's only about, what are there? 7 or 8 billion people now. In terms of the movie and television business, it's probably about 1 million people. So it's a relatively small business, but people can always break in. And the good thing about the industry is it's always looking for young people to help and start, and three. And I say this when I speak to media, not companies, but colleges, in film and communication, etc. It's like, the importance. Almost everybody I meet or met or know in the industry is always ready to be a mentor to somebody. And so my advice, and I think we placed 30 people or so over the last couple of years. Just talking to these kids, which is, if you want to be a costumer, then look at all the costumers out there and study their films, and then decide who are the 5 ones that you really want to work with, and then think about why you would want to work with them. And then take that and write them a letter about why you like them, and hope that they continue with what they're doing, and start engaging in a conversation. Don't come out right away with like, "Hey, you have a job for me," but they will remember that letter, and because they don't get any letters. Don't send them an email. Don't send them a meme. Don't send them a text. Send them a letter. Send an old-fashioned letter, because what happens is it arrives on the desk, and you don't just just don't read it and you generally, unless it's like spam or like, here's a great discount for you. But really a legitimate letter written from the heart, they're going to remember that. I mean, the only people who ever get letters are Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. Nobody else gets letters. And so, but it's very important to recognize their gift, because if you recognize their gift in a letter, and that why you like the scene, or why you like the costume, or why you like the hairstyle, or whatever area you're interested in pursuing, that will touch them. Because if you can look at 10 movies that they were involved with, and you can cite 2 or 3 remarkable moments, those more often than not were also remarkable moments for them. The advice I ever got, and this is from the standpoint of the industry, is when Don Simpson, I was hired as story editor, and it was after hours, and he was saying, I know your plan is to take my job. And so, well, I don't know. I don't even know what really your job is, Don. I said, oh, don't give me that. I said, here's the thing. If you want my job, president of production, then you need to, you're story editor now, you need to be indispensable. Mm-hmm. And I didn't need to hear one more word from his mouth. I needed no explanation. I knew exactly of the head of production, which is to try to be indispensable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very good advice when you're working inside a corporation. It can be anything. It can be helping out with a presentation. It can be getting somebody a cup of coffee. It can be staying late one night with somebody who needs some help with a project. Whatever that may be, you're there. So I don't know. It's just, listen, I am what I am, but I'm no great shakes. And the fact that I was able to thrive inside a difficult industry was I think due in large part to eating humble pie and not being afraid to do anything in order to be able to be helpful. Not looking at it as ambition as much as looking at to be an aid to the overall esprit de corps of the company.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that's most of where I come from. You have to be humble in the end, right? And regardless of the level that you're in or the work that you're doing, I think humility in the end it really does pay off. And I can definitely I had an idea of how this conversation would perhaps go, but it's very impressive. I really appreciate you telling me all these stories and all this great advice. And you can definitely tell everything comes from authenticity, and I've mentioned it a couple times, but because it's definitely there.
Well, thank you, Viviana. It's been really a pleasure.
No, thank you. Thank you so much.